Well, welcome to episode 102 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and this time I'm going to talk about Michael Jackson's 1979 solo album, Off the Wall, released on Epic Records. This is a relatively recent reissue of this album, which of course has the classic picture where Michael is effectively rebranding himself from his Jackson 5 days. As the production team says, the suit was our idea, the socks were Michael's, and it's a gatefold album with extensive lyrics and production notes inside. Quite a nice package. So this is Michael in 1979 launching himself as an adult pop star, and as I mentioned, rebranding himself, emerging from the aura of his family group, which to this point he had not yet accomplished. He's working with a new producer, Quincy Jones. It's goodbye to the bubblegum pop of the early 1970s and the early part of his career with the Jackson 5, and in comes incredibly slick R&B influenced dance and pop music. This album is a real team effort with his producer and the rest of the team. It's mostly cover tunes. There are only 3 songs here written by Michael, and it's an absolute blockbuster of a record. So MJ's story is pretty well known, just touch on the high points here. He's born in Gary, Indiana in 1958. He's the 8th of 10 children. His dad, Joe, is a hard-driving and kind of abusive character who manages a family singing group, the 5 brothers, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and Michael. The Jackson 5 achieves a degree of fame in the later 1960s, and they signed with Motown. They were a pop sensation. Michael becomes a teen idol. Songs like ABC, The Love You Save, I'll Be There, I Want You Back, and so on. During this period, the brothers, and particularly Michael, increasingly came to resent the domination which they were getting from 2 different angles. One from their father, who was physically and verbally abusive and rather uncompromising when it came to driving his boys to work harder and harder, and the other from Berry Gordy, the Motown executive impresario, who exerted all kinds of artistic and professional control over the output and activities of the band. It's easier to leave your record label than it is to leave your parents, and so in 1975, the Jackson brothers have had it with Motown. They leave for Epic Records and they rebrand themselves the Jacksons. And they have some pretty big success with their album on Epic, Destiny, which has a couple big hits, Shake Your Body Down to the Ground and Blame It on the Boogie. So things are looking up. But Michael's still feeling a little bit stifled. He had put out a number of solo albums before in the early 1970s, but he's clearly the most talented and gifted of the brothers, and he doesn't really have the creative outlet he feels he needs. In 1978, he's offered a movie part in The Wiz, and this is a movie which remade the Wizard of Oz story. It's got Diana Ross, Nipsey Russell, Michael Jackson, and others. The film was a bit of a dud, but the music was better, and Jackson comes out of that with a little bit of credit from his contribution, but also, critically, with a new association, and that was with Quincy Jones, who had produced the soundtrack to the film. Quincy and Michael hit it off, and Michael sees in Quincy an avenue out of his current circumstance. During this period, he'd been meeting all kinds of people in the New York music scene. He'd been going to Studio 54. He was listening to all kinds of different stuff. And he was telling anyone who would listen that he wanted to make a record which was not like a Jackson's record, which was much more an individual statement of his own. So that statement ends up being this album, Off the Wall, which is produced by Quincy Jones. And it's the first of 3 consecutive enormous albums which Quincy produces for Michael: Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad. Quincy, who by this point had enormous experience both as an out-and-out legit jazz musician but also as a producer in both jazz and pop, could see what he had in Michael. He also knew what he needed to bring in and who he needed to bring in order to allow Michael to realize his vision. So he and Michael sit down, they begin to go through all kinds of music which might appear in the album. Michael's got a handful of tracks which he's written, but he doesn't have enough for a full record. They pick a Stevie Wonder track, they pick a Paul McCartney track. Quincy also brings in Rod Temperton, who was the main songwriter for the UK disco band Heatwave, and Temperton himself ends up with 3 songwriting credits in this album. The original plan was just for 1 song, but Michael actually liked all 3 of the songs that Temperton had written, and so they all appear on the album. Michael and Quincy had an overriding philosophy for this album too. They wanted it to be a dance album, but not necessarily a disco album. As Quincy tells the story, they admired disco music, but they felt it had basically gone as far as it could go, and in his words, our underlying plan was to take disco out. The album profits from so much that Quincy is able to bring to it, including the people that were in his Rolodex. So he brings in Louis Johnson, the incredible slap bass player from the Brothers Johnson, which was another Quincy Jones project. Brings in the Sea Wind Horns, who were this wickedly tight horn section, and the ringers include the keyboardist Greg Phillinganes, who had done all kinds of work in the years immediately prior to this album with Stevie Wonder and Stevie Wonder's backup band, Wonderlove. All the production of the album happened in LA. When it came time to record, Michael's tracks were done at Alan Zent's recording, different parts of different tracks were done at a variety of different studios all across the city. Strangely, because it's since sold 20 million copies, it only went to number 3 in the pop charts, but it did go to number 1 on the R&B charts and stayed there for 16 weeks. The album starts as one of the 3 Michael Jackson compositions, which is Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. This would go on to be one of his best loved songs. His voice is very often just an instrument unto itself, and that's kind of what you get here. It's a little bit tricky actually trying to make out the lyrics unless you've got a cheat sheet. It's kind of beside the point. His ability to conjure up different vocal textures is just fantastic. The groove is really, really tight. It's a great dance tune. It's just an excellent song start to finish. That's followed up with the first of the 3 songs written by Rod Temperton, Rock With You, which is probably the biggest hit to come out of this album. And this song is kind of 2 different things at the same time. On the one hand, it's an upbeat dance tune. On the other hand, Michael delivers the lyric in a very gentle, drawn-out way, and so you almost have a ballad over top of a dance tune. You can tell that it's partly a ballad because Temperton had actually offered the song to Karen Carpenter first. She turned it down. Jackson picks it up, and it becomes part of pop and dance history. It's an absolutely magical piece of music. Side 1 concludes with Michael's last 2 songwriting contributions to the album, Working Day and Night and Get on the Floor. The first of those, Working Day and Night, even though it's a bit of a deep cut on the album, is a fan favorite, total up-tempo funk. The horns here and all the way through the album are a total highlight. So tight, so intricate, so well arranged. Get on the Floor is all about the righteous slap bass by Louis Johnson and the Brothers Johnson. Really strong song for an album track. Whereas Jackson's compositions dominate side 1, side 2 is composed entirely of cover songs, 6 in all. Despite, or because of that, I don't think it's as strong a side as side 1. The first of those is Temperton's second offering, which is Off the Wall, the title track. It's another example, along with Rock With You, of Jackson's ability to deliver a very gentle lyric over a really tight groove. This is a really strong song, and so at this point in the album, 5 songs in, there hasn't been a weak moment yet. That's followed by a song by Paul McCartney called Girlfriend. Paul had actually written it for Michael in 1978, but he'd then gone on to actually record it himself on Wings' album London Town later that year. A year later here, Michael's recording it. He changes it a bit. He leaves out the bridge. It's an okay pop tune. I don't think Paul was at his best here. Paul was kind of in a songwriting decline after about 1975, and that shows up. Michael's version is better. I don't think either version is particularly good, and this is where the album starts to diminish in quality. But Michael then picks up his sparkly socks with a ballad, She's Out of My Life, which is notable beyond anything else for the remarkable vocal delivery that he provides here. So emotional, quite something, and again, another song which is really beloved amongst Michael Jackson fans. The next song is I Can't Help It, which is a Stevie Wonder song, or a Stevie Wonder song co-written with Suze Green. This was a song which was actually intended for Songs in the Key of Life, but didn't make the cut for that, and Stevie offered it to Michael, who records it here. This is another change of pace. You can totally tell it's a Stevie song. The changes here are so similar to those on Songs in the Key of Life and so many songs in that album. And it's an interestingly jazzy arrangement. This is actually one of my favorite tunes in this album, even though it's one of the deeper cuts. Second last song on the album is a duet with Patti Austin called It's the Falling in Love. This is written by Carol Bayer-Sager and David Foster. It's pretty good without being amazing. The last tune is the last of the Temperton tracks as well, and it's Burn This Disco Out. This is, I have to say, pretty standard issue disco. I think that Temperton's other contributions to the album are pretty great. This is just okay, just like frankly a lot of the music from Heatwave I thought was just okay, so the album ends with a bit of a whimper. This was an album which was expressly designed to allow dance music to move beyond disco. While in some respects it does that, it also respects one of the most basic tenets of all disco, which is forget about your worries, shut up and dance. But you have to say they really did succeed in moving beyond disco. Quincy Jones brings so much to this. The arrangements are so complex. The influences on the album are so diverse. The combination of all that is to make this a much more interesting album than the typical disco album of the day. It also helps, I think, to see this album in terms of the end of disco and the whole disco sucks thing, which was basically a racist backlash against disco in general by white DJs and white people, in my humble opinion. Here, Michael is unabashedly making a music that celebrates black dance music and that environment. On his next 2 albums, he wouldn't do that. His next 2 albums, which are huge albums, which are world-beating, massive sellers, he is reaching out and being a crossover artist in many ways. And while that's great for him, and it solidified his legacy as a so-called king of pop, You can also see that that involves a number of gimmicks. None of those gimmicks or pandering are on this record. This is a straight up dance record aimed squarely at the people who love disco, who love R&B. As such, I kind of see this as, of his three big records, the most honest of the three. I don't think it's a perfect record. I think it runs out of gas. At least two or three of the tracks not really worthy of what he'd go on to do later, or even what he did in this album. But it's still a really strong album. It's still a major statement, somebody striking out his own. And I think you have to give this album 4.5 stars.